My parents handed my sister Grandma's $4 million house before the lawyer had even finished reading the will. That is not an exaggeration. My mother actually reached across the polished walnut table, squeezed Madison's hand, and whispered, "It's finally yours." My father leaned back in his chair like a man watching an investment mature right on schedule. And my sister, Madison, gave this tiny, perfect smile I had seen my whole life. The kind that said she had already accepted congratulations in her head. We were sitting in my grandmother's attorney's office in downtown Boston, 6 days after her funeral, with rain tapping softly against the windows and the city blurred gray beyond the glass. The room smelled like old paper, coffee gone cold, and expensive furniture polish. I remember every detail because in that moment, something inside me went very still. The attorney, Martin Whitaker, had just read the line about the Beacon Hill house, the one everyone in my family talked about in lowered, reverent voices, as if it were less a home and more a crown. A 4-story brick townhouse on one of the prettiest streets in the city. Original molding. Private courtyard. A blue-chip piece of old Boston worth just over $4 million. My grandmother's pride. My mother's obsession. My sister's fantasy. Never mine, apparently. Not in their minds. Not ever. Madison exhaled like she had been holding her breath for years. My father gave her a look that was almost triumphant. And then, before I could even process the weight of what I had just heard, my mother turned toward me with that soft, fake expression she always used when she wanted to look gracious in front of witnesses and said, "You understand, Olivia. This house always made more sense for Madison. Always. As if it had already been settled. As if my grandmother's life, her choices, her memory, had already been translated into the family language I grew up with. Madison gets the best. Olivia gets the explanation." I didn't say anything. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to the rain. Because when you spend your whole life being underestimated, you learn something useful. You learn that silence makes arrogant people careless. And careless people reveal themselves. Martin Whitaker slowly removed his glasses. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just carefully, like a man about to correct a dangerous mistake. Then he reached to the far right corner of his desk and placed his hand on a sealed cream envelope. "I should clarify," he said, his voice even, almost too calm, "that Mrs. Evelyn Harper left additional written instructions to be opened only if any beneficiary or family member attempted to claim, assign, or celebrate transfer of the property before all conditions and amendments had been fully read." The room changed. It did not explode. It tightened. My mother's smile froze first. Then Madison's fingers slipped out from under hers. My father straightened in his chair. And I stared at that envelope like it had a pulse. "This," he said, sliding one finger beneath the seal, "is the second envelope. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 32 years old. And until that morning in Martin Whitaker's office, I had spent most of my life believing that the Bennett family had already decided who mattered more. Madison was the golden girl. I was the reasonable one. Which sounds flattering until you realize reasonable is the word people use when they want you to accept less without making a scene. Madison got the warm spotlight. I got the moral homework. She got celebrated for existing. I got praised for being so mature whenever I swallowed disappointment without flinching. When she turned 16, my parents gave her a silver Mercedes with a white bow the size of a patio umbrella. When I turned 16, my father told me building character mattered more than getting everything handed to me. When Madison picked a private college in New York that cost more per semester than some people make in a year, my parents called it an investment. When I chose a strong state school and worked evenings to cover what scholarships didn't, they called me practical. Madison was expensive. I was efficient. Madison was special. I was dependable. And if that sounds bitter, maybe it is a little. But bitterness has edges. This is sharper than that. This is memory. My grandmother, Evelyn Harper, was the only person in the family who never spoke to me like I was the consolation prize. She noticed things. Small things. Quiet things. She noticed. When I refilled everyone's water at Thanksgiving while Madison told the same story 3 times because people were laughing. She noticed when I stayed after Christmas dinner to wrap china in tissue paper while my mother and sister disappeared upstairs to compare jewelry. She noticed who listened when she talked about property taxes, foundation repairs, roofline preservation, and the headache of maintaining a historic home in a city that charged you for every inch of charm. Madison loved being seen in the Beacon Hill house. I loved listening to it breathe, the old radiators hissing in winter, the creak of the staircase after midnight, the way late afternoon light moved across the dining room wall like a slow gold hand. My grandmother once told me that old houses were like families. If you ignored the hidden damage because the front looked beautiful, one day the whole thing cracked. I did not know then how literally she meant it. Sitting in that office, with the rain against the windows and my mother suddenly too quiet and Madison staring at the envelope like it had betrayed her personally, I realized something that should have frightened me more than it did. My grandmother had known exactly who they were. Not in some vague, sentimental way. Not with the tired patience older women are often forced to perform for the sake of family peace. No. She had seen the machinery, the favoritism, the assumptions, the hunger dressed up as entitlement. And somehow, in the final stretch of her life, she had decided not just to witness it, but to answer it. Martin unfolded the paper inside with deliberate care. My father opened his mouth, probably to object, but something in the attorney's expression stopped him. It was not rude. It was not emotional. It was worse for people like my parents. It was unimpressed. These instructions, Martin said, were handwritten by Mrs. Harper and executed with a related amendment to the trust 43 days before her passing. 43 days. My mind caught on the number. 43 days before she died, I had sat with Grandma in her sunroom drinking tea while she asked me whether I thought loyalty and obedience were the same thing. I thought she was being philosophical. I should have known better. With Grandma, questions were never just questions. Martin looked down at the page again. My sister's face had gone. Pale in a way I had never seen before, like for the first time in her life, she had arrived at a door that would not open just because she smiled at it. My mother's posture was perfect, which was how I always knew she was panicking. My father was angry already, though he had not yet found the safest target. And me? I was suddenly aware of my own heartbeat. Slow, heavy, measured, like footsteps in a long hallway. Because whatever was about to happen next, I knew one thing with complete certainty. That second envelope was not just paper. It was a message. And for the first time in my life, I had the terrifying feeling that my grandmother had not simply left behind an inheritance. She had left behind a test. Martin paused just long enough for the silence to do its work. That was something I would come to understand about men like him. Truly competent people do not rush when everyone else is losing control. They slow down. They let the truth arrive at its own pace. My father was the first to crack. What exactly is this supposed to mean? He asked, his voice clipped and hard, as if confusion itself were an insult. Martin did not look up right away. He adjusted the page once, carefully, then said, "It means Mrs. Harper anticipated the possibility of presumptive conduct regarding the Beacon Hill property. She drafted a contingency instruction in response." My mother gave a short, brittle laugh. Presumptive conduct. That sounds absurd. Madison did nothing wrong. Madison sat very still beside her, but I could see it in the tightness around her mouth. She had gone from confident to cautious in less than 10 seconds. That alone told me everything. People who know they are standing on solid ground do not look frightened by paperwork. Martin finally lifted his eyes. I did not say anyone had done anything wrong yet. Yet. The word landed softly. Still, it landed. I kept my hands folded in my lap and fixed my attention on the grain of the conference table. Walnut. Dark. Smooth. One long natural seam running down the center, like a crack that had been polished instead of repaired. Somehow that felt appropriate. I had spent enough years in rooms like this one, professional rooms, sterile rooms, rooms where outcomes were shaped by language. More than volume, to know that speaking too early was often a mistake. My family had always relied on momentum, assumption, Social pressure. The force of saying something confidently enough that everyone else accepted it as fact. But legal documents did not care who had the brightest smile. They did not care who my mother preferred in Christmas photographs. They only cared what had been written, signed, witnessed, and preserved. That was the first time that thought gave me comfort instead of grief. Martin continued. Mrs. Harper wrote that if any member of the family behaved as if transfer of the Beacon Hill house had already been completed before the full reading of all trust conditions and supplemental amendments, that conduct was to be considered relevant to the question of stewardship. Stewardship. There it was. Not ownership. Not entitlement. Stewardship. A word my grandmother had used often and never casually. Madison let out a breath and shook her head as if this were all some dramatic misunderstanding. I do not even know what that means, she said. It was a smart line, actually. Harmless on the surface. Innocent. But too polished. Too quick. Madison had always known exactly how to sound misunderstood instead of cornered. My mother leaned forward. Surely you can see how emotional everyone is. We just buried Evelyn. She said my grandmother's name with practiced sadness, the same way she had at the funeral, chin lowered just enough, voice softened just enough, every gesture calibrated for sympathy. I used to think that kind of performance took effort. As an adult, I realized for some people it was simply muscle memory. Martin placed the paper flat on the desk. Mrs. Harper was specific. Her words, not mine. Then he read from the page. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just clearly. If anyone in that room reaches for that house before the truth of their character reaches them first, then let this be the moment I speak plainly. My throat tightened. That sounded exactly like her. Elegant, direct, a little merciless when she had finally had enough. Martin read on. A house is not a prize for the loudest daughter, the prettiest story, or the parent most determined to stage manage love. A house, especially one that has survived more than 1 century, belongs only in the hands of the person who knows how to protect what is fragile without turning it into a performance. No one moved. The rain against the windows seemed louder. Or maybe everything else had just gone quiet enough for me to hear it. Madison stared straight ahead. My mother's face changed in tiny, almost invisible increments. One muscle near her jaw. A faint lift of the chin. That was how she looked when she was trying to calculate whether denial or indignation would serve her better. My father took the more predictable route. This is ridiculous, he said. Evelyn was old. She was emotional. She wrote all kinds of sentimental things. Martin did not react. This amendment was witnessed and properly executed. That does not mean she was thinking clearly. It was such an ugly thing to say that even Madison flinched. Not out of morality, I think. Out of strategy. He had said the quiet part too soon. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. My father, Thomas Bennett, 61 years old, retired financial consultant, pressed navy suit, silver cufflinks, and the same impatient eyes that had dismissed half my life as overreaction. He genuinely thought the structure would bend for him if he pushed hard enough. That had always been his operating theory. Teachers. Neighbors, service staff, family. He moved through the world as if enough confidence could replace legitimacy. Usually, with ordinary people it worked, but Martin was not ordinary, and neither, apparently, was my grandmother's planning. Mrs. Harper was clear-minded, Martin said, and thorough. Then he reached for a second sheet. My mother shifted in her chair. There is more. Yes. She sat back without meaning to. I saw it happen. One tiny surrender of posture. It might have been nothing to anyone else. To me, it felt seismic. Because in our family, my mother did not retreat. She redirected. She reframed. She smoothed. But she almost never stepped back. Supplemental note, Martin said. To be read only if there's objection to my state of mind, intent, or freedom from pressure. He glanced down and continued. I am not confused. I am not frightened. And I am not being manipulated by the granddaughter who never needed me to bankroll her self-worth. The one who stayed when there was no audience is the one I trust when there finally is one. I felt the words before I fully heard them. They moved through me slowly, almost painfully, because they touched something I had spent years trying to deaden. It is one thing to survive being underestimated. It is another thing entirely to discover that someone saw the whole thing and remembered. My sister turned toward me then. Not fully. Just enough. A sharp little glance, almost disbelieving. It was the first time that morning she had looked at me as if I might matter to the outcome. Strange how quickly respect appears when money gets involved. Strange how little it has to do with love. I wish I could say I felt triumphant in that moment. I did not. Not yet. Mostly I felt exposed. Because if Martin kept reading, and if my grandmother had truly done what I was beginning to suspect she had done, then the story my family had told about me for years was about to collapse in public. And while that sounds satisfying in theory, in real life it can feel terrifying. When people build a role around you, even a cruel one, you learn how to function inside it. You learn where the walls are. You learn how much disappointment to expect, how much distance to maintain, how little to hope for. But when the walls begin to crack, you are not only watching them fall around other people. You are also standing in the dust, trying to figure out who you are without them. Martin set the page down and folded his hands. Mrs. Harper also directed that I remind all present that the Beacon Hill property was held in trust structure, not as a casual gift, and that final stewardship was conditioned on demonstrated independence from parental coercion, social vanity, and financial opportunism. Madison blinked. What does that even mean? Her voice was thinner now, less polished, more real. Martin answered without hesitation. It means your grandmother did not believe a beautiful house should become a stage set for unresolved family dynamics. My mother inhaled sharply. That is offensive. It is accurate, he said. The room went still again. That was the thing about truth in a controlled room. It does not need to shout. It only needs to remain standing after everyone else runs out of language. My eyes drifted to the windows, where rain traced narrow silver lines down the glass. Boston looked blurred and distant beyond them. For a second, I thought of Grandma's front parlor in Beacon Hill. The pale blue silk wallpaper she had protected for decades. The marble fireplace. The old brass umbrella stand by the door. The faint scent of cedar in the upstairs hall closet. As a child, I thought the house was elegant. As an adult, I understood what it really was. Work, discipline, restraint, timing. You could not bully an old house into thriving. You had to pay attention. You had to notice what shifted with the seasons, what warped in damp weather, what needed reinforcement before the damage became visible. Maybe that was why Grandma loved it so much. Maybe that was why she did not trust Madison with it. Maybe that was why, without realizing it, she had been teaching me all along. My father leaned forward, palms flat on the table. Enough with the vague language. Is Madison getting the house or not? There it was. Stripped bare at last. Not grief. Not memory. Not even fairness. Just possession. Martin looked at him for one long second, then lowered his eyes to the final page in front of him. I have not reached that portion yet, he said. And something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller, tighter, charged. My heartbeat slowed instead of rising. That always happened to me when things became serious enough. The panic burned off. What remained was clarity. My grandmother had seen the machinery. She had named it. And now, one sentence at a time, she was turning it toward the light. Martin let the silence hold for one more breath, then lowered his eyes to the page in front of him, as if what came next had already been decided long before any of us walked into that office. My father made a frustrated sound under his breath. Madison shifted in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, and then uncrossing it almost immediately, which was something she only did when she was trying to look composed and failing. My mother, Patricia, had gone unnaturally still. I knew that stillness. It was not calm. It was calculation. Pursuant to the Harper Family Residential Trust, Martin said, the Beacon Hill property is not transferred as a simple personal gift. It remains under trust protection until the named steward satisfies the character and independence conditions set forth by Mrs. Harper. My father leaned forward. Named steward? Martin did not answer him right away. Instead, He turned the page with careful precision. The sound of paper moving through that quiet room seemed louder than it should have been. Mrs. Harper included a private statement explaining the purpose of those conditions. I am instructed to read it in full. My mother smiled then, but it was a brittle thing. All surface and no warmth. This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic. Martin glanced at her.
No.
It is becoming specific. I felt that line settle somewhere deep in my chest. Specific. That was the word my whole life had lacked. My family dealt in impressions, assumptions, atmospheres. Madison was charming. I was difficult. Madison was polished. I was intense. Madison was easy to celebrate. I was too serious. Those labels had floated over every room we ever entered, and because they were vague, they could never be pinned down and challenged. But specifics were different. Specifics could be measured. Specifics could be remembered. Specifics could outlive anyone's favorite version of the story. Martin began to read. If you are hearing this, then someone in the room has mistaken access for worthiness. That mistake has been encouraged for years, and I regret my silence when it might have protected the wrong child from becoming too comfortable and the right one from becoming too accustomed to disappointment. The room did not move. It was as if even the rain had pulled back from the windows to listen. My throat tightened, so suddenly I had to press my tongue lightly against the back of my teeth just to steady my breathing. The wrong child. The right one. Grandma had never spoken carelessly. If she wrote those words, she had chosen every single one of them. Madison let out a disbelieving laugh. What does that even mean? But her voice did not have its usual float to it anymore. It sounded thinner now. Younger. Less certain. Martin continued, as though she had not spoken. One granddaughter learned that affection follows performance. The other learned that peace depends on asking for less. Only one of those lessons builds the kind of judgment a historic home requires. My mother turned toward him sharply. You cannot possibly be suggesting Evelyn intended to insult her own family. I am not suggesting anything, Martin said. I am reading her words. Then he went on. Beauty without discipline decays. Entitlement without character destroys. And a house that has survived 118 years does not belong to the person who photographs well on its front steps. It belongs to the person who understands the cost of keeping it standing. I closed my eyes for half a second. 118 years. Of course, she had put the exact number in. Grandma loved exact numbers. She said they kept sentimental people honest. Suddenly, I was not in that law office anymore. I was back in her kitchen 3 winters earlier, sitting at the narrow marble island while she reviewed invoices from a mason and a preservation contractor. Madison had been upstairs taking mirror selfies in the guest room with the best light. My mother had called down, laughing. She just loves this house so much. Grandma had not looked up from the paperwork. She had only said, loving a house and liking its reflection are not the same thing. At the time, I had almost smiled into my coffee. Now, sitting in Martin Whitaker's office, I understood that she had been taking notes on all of us for years. Please proceed, my father said, each word clipped and strained. Martin nodded once. The named steward of the Beacon Hill property, contingent on all conditions herein, is Olivia Bennett. There are moments that feel loud even when no one speaks. That was one of them. No one moved for what felt like several seconds. My own name seemed to hang in the air between the framed diplomas on the wall and the rain-streaked windows behind Martin's desk, suspended there like something fragile and impossible. Olivia Bennett.
Me.
Not the extra daughter. Not the reliable backup plan. Not the practical one. Just me. The first thing I felt was not joy. It was disbelief. Not because I thought I had done something wrong, but because after enough years of being quietly pushed to the edge of every family picture, every decision, every celebration, you stop expecting the center of anything to open for you. My sister was the one who broke the silence. That is insane. Her voice cracked on the second word. Grandma would not do that. Martin looked at her. She did. Madison turned to my mother so fast her chair made a sharp sound against the floor. Mom. Just that. One word, but full of panic, as if Patricia Bennett. could still walk over to reality itself and smooth its collar until it looked more flattering. My mother's face remained impressively controlled, but I could see the strain in it now, the effort it took to keep her mouth neutral, her shoulders back, her chin lifted. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said. "Olivia never even wanted that house." I almost laughed then, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. That was always the move. Tell me what I wanted. Tell me what I meant. Tell me who I was, until eventually everyone in the room forgot to ask me directly. But this time no one looked at her. They looked at Martin. And, slowly, at me. "Desire was not the standard Mrs. Harper used," Martin said. "Stewardship was." My father gave a cold, incredulous shake of his head. "Olivia does not have the lifestyle for that property." Lifestyle. The word was so absurd I finally turned and met his eyes. "What exactly is the lifestyle for a house, Dad?" I asked. My voice came out calmer than I felt. "Good lighting and inherited certainty?" His expression hardened. He did not like it when I answered cleanly. He liked me best when I was emotional enough to dismiss. My mother stepped in before he could. "This is not the time for sarcasm." "No," I said softly. "It is the time for specifics." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Something had shifted the second Martin said my name. I could feel it, not just in them, in me. For years I had learned to survive family rooms by becoming smaller inside them, taking up less space, reacting less, wanting less. But Grandma had done something dangerous from beyond the grave. She had created a document that matched what I had always known and never been allowed to prove. She had turned instinct into evidence. Martin reached for another page. "The designation of Olivia Bennet is accompanied by findings supporting that decision." Madison stared at him. "Findings?" "Mrs. Harper's word," he said. "Again, not mine." He adjusted the page and began to read from a list that sounded less like sentiment and more like a record. Olivia assisted with contractor scheduling after the chimney repointing review in March. Olivia reviewed tax notices and caught a filing discrepancy regarding the rear garden assessment. Olivia coordinated cedar closet restoration while preserving original hardware. Olivia declined reimbursement on 3 occasions when the work exceeded the errand she was asked to perform. Olivia has never once referred to the property as a prize. Each sentence landed like a small, controlled detonation, because they were true, and because no one in my family had ever imagined that the quiet things I did when no one was paying attention were being counted. My grandmother had counted them, not to make me earn love, but to identify character. Madison's face had gone from pale to tight with humiliation. "She made Olivia sound like an employee," she snapped. "No," Martin said. "She made Olivia sound reliable." That hurt Madison more than anything else he could have said, because reliability is invisible right up until everything valuable depends on it. My mother folded her hands together on the table, so neatly that if you did not know her, you might have thought she was serene. "And what, exactly, are these conditions Olivia is supposed to satisfy?" Martin looked down at the final page. Mrs. Harper required a 90-day review period following this reading. During that time, the named steward must choose whether to accept the role under trust terms, maintain the property according to existing preservation standards, and remain free from outside family control or pressure. He paused. Then he added, "Any coercive interference by relatives triggers immediate restriction of access." At that, something inside me went very cold and very clear. Grandma had not merely seen the family dynamic. She had built a legal perimeter around it. For one suspended second, no one in the room seemed to understand what that meant except me. Not because I had expected any of this. I had not. But because I knew my grandmother. And once I heard the phrase "free from outside family control or pressure," I recognized her hand completely. She had not just chosen a successor. She had anticipated the backlash. She had predicted the exact shape of it. My father recovered first, which did not surprise me. Men like him always mistake speed for authority. "This is outrageous," he said, leaning back as if distance alone could make the document less real. "You are effectively accusing us of coercion before anything has even happened." Martin did not blink. I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am explaining the operating terms of the trust. My mother turned to me then, not fully, just enough to bring me into the performance. Her expression softened into what strangers probably thought was maternal concern. I knew better. That face only appeared when she needed the room to believe she was being generous. Olivia, she said gently, you do understand this places you in a very uncomfortable position. There it was. Not congratulations. Not surprise. Not even a thin imitation of happiness for me. Just a pivot. An attempt to make my grandmother's decision sound like a burden I should be relieved to decline. I looked at her and felt something strange settle in me. Not anger exactly. Recognition. The clean kind. The kind that arrives when you finally stop waiting for someone to become who they were never going to be. I think Grandma understood that, I said. My voice was quiet, but it held. That is probably why she planned for it. My mother's eyes changed. Only slightly. A tiny narrowing. A recalculation. She had expected hesitation. She had expected me to flinch under the weight of the room and apologize for making things awkward, the way I used to when I was younger, and still thought harmony was a moral achievement instead of a tool certain people used to keep the truth from surfacing. Madison let out a sharp breath. This is insane. Olivia does not know the first thing about running a property like that. I almost looked at her then, but I did not. Instead, I kept my eyes on Martin, because that was another thing I had learned over time. The person with the loudest opinion in the room is not always the person with the most power. Often they are just the one panicking fastest. Martin folded his hands over the page. Mrs. Harper seems to have anticipated that objection as well. Madison's face strained again. My father muttered something under his breath that I did not catch. Martin went on. There is a supplementary note regarding capability. He lowered his eyes and read. If anyone claims Olivia lacks the skill to protect that house, let the records correct them. She has already done more unpaid preservation work in 3 years than anyone who will object to this has done in 10. If someone mistakes charm for competence, that is their vanity, not my error. I felt heat rise behind my ribs, sudden and sharp. Not because I was embarrassed, because I remembered. I remembered every one of those quiet errands and practical tasks that no one in my family ever counted as anything meaningful. The afternoon I met the stained glass specialist when Grandma's front landing window started rattling in the wind. The Saturday I spent 3 hours on hold with the city over a permit discrepancy for exterior masonry repairs because Grandma was tired and my mother had said she was too busy. The winter storm when I drove in from Cambridge before dawn because a section of gutter ice had started pulling away from the trim and the property manager was out sick. None of those moments had looked important from the outside. There were no applause lines in them. No elegant photographs. Just salt on the sidewalks. Coffee going cold in paper cups. Contractor invoices spread across antique tables with coasters Grandma insisted on using even over old wood. Madison had never been there for any of that. She had appeared when the hydrangeas bloomed in the courtyard and when the Christmas garlands were up on the iron railings. She had posed in the front hall mirror and told people the house made her feel like she was in a Nancy Meyers movie. Grandma had smiled politely every time. At the time I thought that smile meant indulgence. Now I knew better. It had meant observation. This is absurd, Madison said, and now her voice had lost almost all of its polish. I was at the house all the time. Martin looked at the page again. Mrs. Harper addressed that too. He continued reading. Presence is not stewardship. Attendance is not care. And affection expressed only in flattering light is not devotion. A person who loves a house because it elevates her image will eventually strip it of whatever cannot be monetized, simplified, or displayed. My mother's jaw tightened so hard I could see the tension all the way across the table. Evelyn would never say something that cruel, but even she did not sound certain anymore. And that, more than anything, told me the document was real in a way none of them could talk around. Because my mother knew my grandmother's voice. She knew the elegance of it, the precision, the terrifying courtesy that remained intact even when she was delivering a judgment no one could wriggle out of. Martin laid that page aside and picked up another. The 90-day period begins today. During that time, Olivia Bennett has sole authority to decide whether to accept stewardship under trust supervision. The property may not be entered, altered, photographed for listing, discussed with brokers, or represented as transferred by any other family member. My father sat up straighter. Photographed for listing? Martin looked at him. Yes. My father's silence lasted less than 2 seconds, which was answer enough. My stomach turned. Not from surprise. From confirmation. Somewhere in the back of my mind, pieces clicked together with a quiet, brutal neatness. The recent calls I had overheard after Grandma's health started declining. My mother asking Madison which side of the dining room photographed better in afternoon light. My father talking about capital gain strategy at Sunday lunch, and then claiming he meant something unrelated when I walked in. I had suspected. But suspicion is a lonely thing. It makes you feel petty, paranoid, difficult. Evidence is different. Evidence lets you breathe. Thomas, my mother said under her breath, but it was too late. Martin had already made a note on the paper in front of him. My father saw it and bristled. Do not make this into something it is not. Then help me by being precise, Martin said. Have any listing preparations, pre-market inquiries, valuation updates, or brokerage conversations taken place without trust authorization? My father gave him a hard stare. That is none of your business. Martin did not shift. On the contrary, it is exactly my business. The room went silent again. I looked down at my own hands. I had not realized until then how steady they were. That used to happen to me in emergencies. Not panic. Focus. A strange cold clarity. It was one of the reasons I had done well in compliance work while everyone else in my family favored flashier careers they could describe at cocktail parties. I had built my adult life around details, records, and risk because details do not flatter anyone. They just stay true. Grandma used to tell me that the most dangerous people are not liars. They are editors. The ones who shave the truth down until it fits the story that serves them best. My family had been editing me for years. Quiet Olivia. Practical Olivia. Sensitive Olivia. The daughter who would understand. The daughter who would be fine. The daughter who did not need much. But my grandmother, sitting in that room now only through paper and memory, had done something no one else ever had. She had written the unedited version down. Madison laughed once, a brittle little sound that broke apart in the air. So, what? Olivia just gets to play Lady of the Manor now. I turned to her then. Finally. She looked beautiful, of course. Perfect coat. Perfect hair. Perfect soft neutral lipstick she always wore to look expensive without seeming like she had tried. For years that kind of polish had made people underestimate the emptiness beneath it. But not today. Today all I could see was desperation flickering behind the surface. No, I said. I get 90 days to decide whether I am willing to protect what Grandma actually cared about. Madison stared at me as if I had slapped her, though I had not raised my voice at all. My mother stepped in immediately. You are being emotional. It was almost funny. Of all the lines she could have chosen, she picked the oldest one in the file. The family classic. Emotional. As if emotion were a defect only I carried, and not the engine driving every greedy assumption they had brought into that office. I looked at her and, for the first time in my life, I did not feel 12 years old inside. No, I said softly. I think I am finally being specific. And when I said it, I felt the room shift again. Small, but real. Like a lock turning somewhere deep inside a house that had been waiting a very long time for the right key. For a moment after I said it, no one answered. That was new. In my family, silence usually belonged to me. I was the one expected to absorb the atmosphere, smooth over the sharp edges, and let louder people define the shape of the room. But that morning, in Martin Whitaker's office, the silence belonged to all of us. It sat there between the polished walnut table and the rain-lined windows like a verdict still taking form. Martin broke it first. I will now review the procedural restrictions for the 90-day stewardship period. His tone had not changed once since we sat down. That steadiness was starting to feel almost surreal against the unraveling tension around him. My father shifted back in his chair, jaw tight. Madison crossed her arms. My mother folded her hands so neatly in front of her that it might have passed for composure if I had not known what panic looked like on her. Martin glanced at the trust packet. Effective immediately. No family member other than Olivia Bennett may enter the Beacon Hill property without written authorization from the trust administrator. No removals of personal items, furnishings, records, artwork, silver, jewelry, or archival materials may occur outside supervised inventory procedures. My mother looked up sharply. That is absurd. Evelyn's things belong to family. They belong to the estate, Martin said. And the estate is governed by the trust. My father let out a humorless breath. This is completely disproportionate. Martin turned a page. Mrs. Harper did not believe the risk was hypothetical. The words settled hard. Not hypothetical. Which meant Grandma had not just worried in some abstract, elderly way that people might become greedy around money. She believed it enough to build protections around it. Layers of them. Legal, practical, timed, specific. My throat tightened again, but this time it was not from shock. It was from the slow, painful recognition of how thoroughly she must have understood the family she had spent decades trying not to embarrass in public. Martin continued. A certified inventory team will document the property within 48 hours. During that time, all locks may be rekeyed at the direction of the trust. All alarm codes and vendor access records are to be updated. Madison leaned forward so abruptly her chair gave a faint scrape against the floor. Rekeyed. She looked from Martin to my mother and then to me, as if the very concept were offensive. Why would the locks be changed? Martin met her eyes. Because Mrs. Harper directed that they be changed. That is not an answer. It is the only answer required. I saw the flush rise along Madison's neck. She had spent most of her life encountering people who wanted to please her before she even asked. Sales associates, event staff, extended relatives, people who confused polished manners for actual depth. She still had not learned what happened when charm met procedure. Procedure does not blush. It does not improvise. It does not care who expected a softer landing. My mother turned toward Martin. With a smile so controlled it almost impressed me. Surely, in a matter this emotional, some flexibility would be reasonable. Madison has several personal mementos in the upstairs guest suite. I looked at her then. The upstairs guest suite. Not even a subtle claim. Territory marked in language. As if the room had been inching toward permanence in family conversation long before Grandma died. Martin made a note with his fountain pen. Those items may be requested through inventory review. My father's eyes narrowed. You keep writing things down. Martin capped his pen. Idag. For what purpose? For the record. My father's mouth flattened. For the record. Another phrase people like him hate. Because records outlast tone. They outlast influence. They outlast the polished retelling of what supposedly happened. I had built my entire adult life around that truth, and in that moment I could feel how much my grandmother had understood me. She knew I trusted documents more than promises. She knew I had spent years learning how systems worked because people were so unreliable. She knew I would hear the structure in all this and understand it as care, not cruelty. Care. A perimeter where there had never been one before. Martin looked at me then for the first time in several minutes. Ms. Bennett, under the trust you may choose to appoint an independent property liaison for the review period if you prefer not to interact directly with family requests. Ms. Bennett. He had shifted from Olivia to Ms. Bennett without making a show of it, and somehow that tiny formal courtesy did more for me than any sympathetic glance could have. It reminded me that I was not a child in a family dispute. I was the designated steward in a legal proceeding. I felt my spine straighten almost without thinking. I would like to review the options before deciding, I said. Of course. My mother turned toward me immediately. Olivia, there is no need to make this colder than it already is. There it was again. The instinctive framing. Cold. Difficult. Unnecessary. Every time I moved 1 inch away from the role she had assigned me, she reached for adjectives as if they could herd me back into place. I looked at her and, for the first time, did not feel guilty for understanding what she was doing in real time. I am not making it cold, I said. I am making it clear. Madison laughed once under her breath. You are loving this. It was almost a reflex, that accusation. As if any woman who finally stopped apologizing must secretly be enjoying conflict for sport. I turned to her slowly. No, I said. I think you just do not know what it looks like when I stop making things easier for you. That landed. I could tell because she looked away first. My father leaned forward, palms flat against the table again. Enough. We are all family here. The sentence would have worked on me once. Years ago. Back when I still believed family was a moral fact instead of a relationship people had to honor through conduct. But Grandma had stripped away the fog in one brutal move. Family here had meant hierarchy. Family here had meant Madison first, Patricia managing optics, Thomas managing outcomes, and me learning not to ask for anything that would require someone to see me clearly. Martin answered before I could. The trust does not suspend itself for sentiment. My father stared at him. Sentiment. Yes, Martin said calmly. The kind selectively invoked when structure becomes inconvenient. I almost looked down to hide the reaction that flashed across my face, but I did not. I let myself feel it. That strange, dangerous thing building quietly inside me. Not revenge. Not even vindication, not yet. Something steadier. Permission. Permission to stop cushioning the truth for people who had never once cushioned it for me. Martin lifted the final sheet in the packet. There is one additional personal letter attached to the procedural section. Mrs. Harper directed that it be read after the restrictions were explained. My mother visibly stiffened. Madison whispered, "Oh my God." My father said nothing. Martin unfolded the page and read. If Patricia says this is cruel, remind her that boundaries only feel like cruelty to those who benefited from their absence. If Thomas says I am overreacting, remind him that men who do not notice favoritism are usually standing in the warmest part of it. If Madison cries, let her. She has been rescued from discomfort often enough to mistake it for injustice. No one breathed. At least that is how it felt. My mother's face went white, then flushed. My father looked stunned in a way I had not thought possible. Madison stared at Martin as if sheer disbelief could stop him from continuing. And me? I sat perfectly still, but inside, memory after memory was rising to meet those words like iron filings pulled toward a magnet. The college tours where my parents talked finances differently for each of us. The birthdays that somehow grew grander when they were hers and smaller when they were mine. The holiday photos where my mother always moved Madison closer to the center. The times Grandma watched all of it and said almost nothing. I used to think her silence meant resignation. Maybe even weakness. Now I saw something else. Timing. She had waited. She had watched. And when she finally chose to speak, she had done it in the only language my family could not interrupt. Martin lowered the page. My mother's voice, when it came, was quiet and brittle. I cannot believe she wrote that about us. I did not mean to speak. The words just arrived. I can. Everyone looked at me. Even Martin. I held my mother's gaze and kept my voice even, because she saw it. The truth of that seemed to move through the room like a change in pressure. My mother looked away first. My father dragged one hand over his tie and exhaled slowly, as if he were trying to regain control simply by slowing his body down. Madison blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears form because tears would prove Grandma right. It struck me then how deeply Grandma had understood all of us, down to the exact defenses we would reach for. Martin stacked the papers into a neat pile. I will have certified copies sent this afternoon. Ms. Bennett, I recommend you refrain from discussing access or future intentions until you have had time to review the full trust terms privately. That seems wise, I said. Wise. Another small thing. But I saw my father react to it. He hated calm competence when it came from me. It was much easier for him when I sounded flustered, emotional, overwhelmed. Calm forced him to confront the possibility that the version of me he had always preferred might never have been real. My mother stood abruptly, then caught herself and sat back down, as if she had risen too quickly into a room that no longer belonged to her instincts. "Olivia," she said, her voice soft again, that familiar softness she always used when she wanted to bypass whatever had just been proven and return us to the version of the family where I could still be handled. "We should all take a breath before anyone makes any irreversible choices." I looked at her, at the woman who had spent my entire life asking me to take a breath whenever breathing too honestly might inconvenience Madison. Then I looked at the trust packet in front of Martin. My name was somewhere inside it, not as an afterthought, not as a consolation, as the point. And for the first time, I understood something with complete, bone-deep clarity. My grandmother had not simply left me an opportunity. She had left me a line in the sand. The question was no longer whether my family would cross it. The question was whether I would finally stop stepping backward every time they did. My mother's words lingered in the room for a second longer than they should have. "Take a breath." As if air had ever been the problem. As if the issue had not been years of being trained to inhale around other people's comfort and exhale around my own. Martin gathered the documents into a precise stack, aligned the corners, and slid the trust packet into a dark blue folder with my name written across a tab in clean black print. Olivia Bennett. Seeing it there did something strange to me. It should not have mattered, maybe. It was only a label. Office supplies. Paper. Ink. But when your identity has spent years being softened, reduced, translated through other people's preferences, there is something almost destabilizing about seeing your name attached to authority without apology. Martin stood. "I will walk Ms. Bennett through the next procedural steps privately." My father stood too quickly. "That will not be necessary." Martin looked at him with the kind of expression that is not rude, only final. "It is already happening." That should have been a small thing. Just a sentence. But I felt it all the way down to my spine. My mother rose next, smoothing the front of her coat, gathering herself with elegant efficiency. Madison remained seated for half a second longer, as if standing would mean accepting the room had moved on without her. Then she stood too. "So that is it?" she asked, looking at me now instead of Martin. "You just get to decide everything?" The old version of me would have rushed to soften that. Would have said this was complicated, temporary, that I had not asked for any of it. All technically true, all strategically useless. Instead, I held her gaze and let the pause sit there. "No," I said at last. "Grandma already decided. I just have to decide whether I am willing to honor it." Madison's expression sharpened. "Hurt, yes. But under that, something more dangerous." Contempt interrupted. She had always known how to perform being wounded when her access to something desirable was challenged. My mother stepped in before she could speak again. "Olivia, whatever Evelyn intended, we do not need to turn this into a spectacle." Spectacle. Another interesting word. My family only used it when someone else named what they had benefited from keeping vague. "No one here is doing that," I said. "Not anymore." My father gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. "You are enjoying your moment." I turned toward him. The windows behind him threw the rain-muted Boston skyline into a silver blur around his shoulders. He looked older than he had an hour ago. Not frail, just exposed in a way men like him rarely are. "You think this is a moment," I said quietly. "That is the difference." Something flickered across his face then. Not remorse. He was not built for that. But recognition, maybe. A brief awareness that the script he had relied on for years was slipping line by line out of his hands. Martin opened the office door and stood aside. "This way, Ms. Bennett." Ms. Bennett again. Formal, measured, clean. I picked up my bag and rose from the chair. My knees felt steady. That surprised me. I had expected a tremor by now, some delayed rush of adrenaline or panic. Instead, I felt almost unnaturally calm, as if my body had finally located the emotional weather pattern it had been training for without knowing it. As I passed my mother, she touched my forearm lightly. To anyone else, it would have looked affectionate. To me, it felt like muscle memory, contact used as management. "Please do not shut us out," she said softly. Her voice was pitched just for me, low and polished and threaded with injury. Families should not have to go through lawyers. I stopped and looked down at her hand on my sleeve. Then I looked back at her face. Families should not need lawyers to make them respect boundaries, I said. I did not pull away sharply. I simply stepped back, and her hand dropped. The silence after that was different from the earlier silences. Less stunned. More aware. Martin led me down a narrow hallway lined with framed legal certificates and black and white photographs of old Boston buildings. Beacon Hill row houses. Federal facades. Iron railings, slick with rain. It struck me as oddly fitting that the first private moment of my life's biggest family rupture should happen surrounded by images of structures designed to endure weather without explaining themselves. Martin opened a smaller conference room at the end of the hall. Inside, there was a round table, a carafe of water, 2 glasses, and a window looking out over a side street washed dark by the rain. He gestured for me to sit. Then he closed the door with a quiet click that sounded, to my overstretched nerves, almost ceremonial. He set the blue folder in front of me. Before we discuss logistics, he said, there is one item Mrs. Harper directed me to give you privately. From the inside pocket of his suit jacket, he removed another envelope. Smaller than the first one. Cream paper again. My name written across the front in Grandma's handwriting. Not the decorative version she used on Christmas cards. Her real handwriting. Firm. Slightly slanted. Unmistakable. For 1 second, I could not move. The room blurred at the edges. She asked that you open it alone, Martin said, and slid it toward me. But before you do, I think you should know something. I lifted my eyes to his. What? He folded his hands. She revised the trust twice in the last 6 months. Not because she was uncertain about you, because she became increasingly certain about everyone else. I let out a breath that felt like it had been caught somewhere behind my ribs since the reading began. Did she say that? Not in those exact words. He gave the faintest suggestion of a smile, but close enough. I looked down at the envelope again. My name, her hand, the strange intimacy of paper that had traveled through no one else's voice yet. There is more you should know, Martin said. Mrs. Harper appointed an independent accounting liaison to assist during the 90-day period. Naomi Reyes. She has already been notified and will contact you this afternoon. There is also an on-call preservation consultant and a secure inventory firm prepared to enter the property tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. The speed of it hit me then. All of this was already in motion. My grandmother had not improvised from fear in her final days. She had built a system. Quietly. Methodically. With backups. I ran my thumb along the edge of the envelope. She really thought they would try something. Martin did not answer right away, which told me more than a quick response would have. Mrs. Harper was a careful observer, he said at last. And she was not sentimental about incentives. I almost laughed, but it would have broken into something too raw. Instead, I nodded once. That sounded exactly like her. When I was 24, I once told Grandma that I hated how cynical the world could feel once you understood what motivated people. She had poured more tea and said, very few people are motivated by what they claim. Watch what they protect when no one is applauding. I had written it down later in the Notes app on my phone because it felt too important to lose. Sitting there now, holding the envelope, I realized she had been leaving me instructions long before she put any on paper. Martin slid a second document from the folder. One more thing. I need to inform you that approximately 3 weeks ago there was an unauthorized inquiry regarding a pre-market valuation of the Beacon Hill property. I looked up so fast the envelope nearly slipped from my fingers. What? A brokerage contact was made. No listing agreement was executed. But the inquiry occurred. Cold moved through me in one clean line. By who? Martin's expression did not change. I am not prepared to formally attribute it until supporting records are finalized. But given the trust language, any corroboration of pre-transfer sale planning by a non-authorized family member will matter. My mind flashed backward with ugly precision. My father's question about capital gains at lunch. My mother asking whether spring or fall photography was better for premium listing visibility. Madison laughing about how the courtyard would look incredible with a cleaner, lighter stone palette, something more modern, more marketable. I had heard all of it. I had filed. it away under suspicion because that was what daughters like me are taught to do when truth would be inconvenient. We call it maybe. We call it probably nothing. We call it me being too sensitive. You suspected this, I said. Martin chose his words carefully. I suspected Mrs. Harper did not include those restrictions by accident. I looked back down at the envelope in my hand. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the muted hum of the building heat behind the walls. Outside, a siren passed somewhere below, distant and blurred by rain. Inside that office, with my grandmother's private letter resting against my fingertips and the first hard evidence of betrayal beginning to take shape, I felt something shift inside me again. It was not shock this time. Shock had already passed through me. This was grief changing form. Grief, stripped of confusion. Grief with a backbone. May I have a minute alone? I asked. Of course. Martin stood, paused by the door, then looked back at me. For what it is worth, Miss Bennet, your grandmother did not sound afraid when she made these arrangements. She sounded relieved. After he left, the room felt larger and quieter all at once. I sat there with the envelope in both hands and stared at my name for several seconds before I finally slid one finger beneath the seal. The paper opened with a soft whisper. Inside was a single folded sheet. I unfolded it carefully, already knowing the first line would undo me. It did. Olivia, if you are reading this, then I was right not about the house, but about the pressure that would gather around it the moment I was gone. I closed my eyes for a second and inhaled slowly. Then I read on. I know what they have made you practice all these years. Grace. Restraint. Accommodation. The art of being easier to overlook than to confront. I am sorry for every time I saw it and chose timing over intervention. That line hit me with such force I had to set the page down for a moment. Not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate. And accuracy, after a lifetime of emotional editing, can feel almost unbearable. I picked the letter back up. You were never overlooked because you lacked value. You were overlooked because your value was inconvenient to people who had already assigned themselves the warmest seats in the room. A house can survive neglect for years if the frame is sound. A person should not have to. If I have done one decent thing late in life, let it be this. Do not confuse being kind with surrender. Do not confuse peace with permission. And do not hand fragile things to people merely because they are offended when denied them. I stared at those last words until the ink blurred. Then I laughed once through the sting behind my eyes. Of course that was how she put it. Elegant. Precise. Ruthless only where truth required it. At the bottom of the letter, beneath her signature, was one final line. I had hoped they might surprise me. I had more confidence in you. I sat very still after that, the paper warm in my hands, the rain still whispering against the glass. And for the first time since walking into Martin Whitaker's office, I understood that the hardest part of what came next would not be deciding whether I could protect my grandmother's house. It would be deciding whether I was finally ready to stop protecting everyone who had never protected me. When I finally left Martin Whitaker's office, the rain had softened from a hard gray sheet into a fine mist that made the city look polished and distant, as if Boston itself had decided to keep its opinions to itself. I held the blue folder close against my side and my grandmother's letter inside my coat pocket, warm from my body now, as though even on paper she had found one more way to stay near me. The reception area outside Martin's private conference room was empty. My family had already gone. That did not surprise me. They had never been good at staying in rooms once the advantage disappeared. For a moment I stood there in the quiet, listening to the muted hum of the office and the faint ticking of a wall clock, and felt something I had not expected. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. The kind that comes when a truth you have carried alone for years finally exists outside your own head. I took the elevator down to the lobby, stepped out onto the wet sidewalk, and did not open my umbrella right away. The cold mist settled against my cheeks and hairline. Traffic moved in patient ribbons along the street. A woman in a camel coat hurried past holding a paper cup. Somewhere behind me, a bus exhaled at the curb. Ordinary city sounds. Ordinary morning. And yet nothing in my life felt ordinary anymore. My phone started vibrating before I even reached the corner. Not ringing. Vibrating. Message after message in quick succession. I did not need to look to know who it was. Still, I stopped beneath the awning of a pharmacy and pulled the phone from my bag. Family group. The one my mother had named Bennett Updates years ago, as if branding could make dysfunction feel organized. Madison, I cannot believe you sat there and let that happen. My mother, please do not respond emotionally. We need to discuss this like adults. My father, call me immediately. Then, seconds later, another from him directly. This can still be handled privately. I stared at the screen and almost laughed. Privately, which in my family had always meant on their terms behind closed doors, before facts could harden into boundaries. I slipped the phone back into my bag without answering. That alone felt radical. I had spent so much of my life replying quickly, soothing quickly, clarifying quickly, stepping in before their discomfort had the chance to grow teeth. But my grandmother's letter was still echoing through me. Do not confuse peace with permission. I walked 3 blocks through the damp afternoon and into a small coffee shop I used to stop at on my way to Grandma's house when I visited on Saturdays. Brick walls. Fogged windows. A barista with silver hoops and a tired, kind face. I ordered tea because Grandma would have approved of the choice, then took a table by the window, and finally opened my phone again. This time there were voicemails. 2 from my mother. 1 from Madison. 1 from my father. And 1 number I did not recognize. Boston area code. I hesitated, then tapped the unknown number first. Ms. Bennett, a woman said. Her voice was clear, warm, professional. This is Naomi Reyes. Martin Whitaker asked me to reach out. I worked with your grandmother on the trust accounting and compliance side. I just wanted to introduce myself and let you know I am available for whatever you need over the next 90 days. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second. Another person. Another layer my grandmother had prepared. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. Naomi paused, and when she spoke again there was something careful in her tone. I also thought you should know we have already initiated document preservation related to the property. Utility records, contractor logs, access lists, and communication archives are being secured. I opened my eyes.
Communication archive.
Yes, she said. Your grandmother had reason to believe certain assumptions were being made prematurely. She preferred not to leave room for confusion. My fingers tightened around the paper cup. So Martin told you about the brokerage inquiry.
He did.
And there may be more. I stared out at the window, at the blurred stream of umbrellas and headlights on the street. There may be more. The sentence sat inside me like ice. Not because I could not believe it, because I could. Too easily. What happens now? I asked. Naomi answered without hesitation. Now you slow everything down. You do not agree to meetings on the fly. You do not discuss strategy in text messages. You do not enter the house alone if you think there is any chance family will show up unannounced. And above all, you do not let anyone frame your boundaries as cruelty. I let out a breath that might almost have been a laugh. Did Grandma tell you to say that? No, Naomi said, and I could hear the smile in her voice now. But I knew her well enough to know she would approve. After we ended the call, I sat there for a long moment, watching steam rise from my tea. It struck me then how careful my grandmother had been in choosing her allies. Martin with his precision, Naomi with her calm competence. People who did not need theatrics because they trusted systems. People who would never ask me to be softer just to make a manipulative person feel less threatened. My phone lit up again. This time Madison. I watched it ring. Let it stop. Ring again. Stop. Then a text. So this is really who you are now? I read it twice. Not because it confused me, because it was almost perfect in its predictability. Not what happened. Not what Grandma intended. Not even whether I was all right. Just identity as accusation.
Who you are now.
As if boundaries were. A personality shift. As if refusing to surrender quietly meant I had transformed into something harsh and unrecognizable. I typed 3 words before deleting them. Typed another sentence. Deleted that too. Then I locked the phone and set it face down on the table. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to understand that not every accusation requires an answer. Some only require endurance. By the time I got back to my apartment in Cambridge, the rain had thinned to a silver drizzle. My building lobby smelled faintly of wet wool and radiator heat. Upstairs, I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, hung my coat, and stood for a moment in the quiet of my own living room. My apartment was not large. One bedroom, tall windows, bookshelves I had assembled myself, a navy sofa with one arm slightly faded by afternoon sun, a kitchen too narrow for more than one person to move comfortably through at a time. And yet standing there, after the polished history and loaded symbolism of the Beacon Hill house, I felt an unexpected swell of affection for the life I had built. It was mine. Every lamp, every dish, every bill paid on time, every inch earned without applause. Grandma had known that too. She had not chosen me because I needed saving. She had chosen me because I had already learned how to stand upright without being held up. I set the blue folder on my dining table and opened it carefully. Trust overview, inventory protocol, preservation standards, contact list, security procedures, a packet of responsibility, not fantasy. Halfway through, my phone rang again. My father. I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Hello. Silence for 1 second. Then his voice, tight with restraint. Your mother is very upset. Of course she was. He opened with her feelings, not the truth. Not the trust. Not the fact that they had apparently been discussing sales strategy before my grandmother was even gone. I imagine she is, I said. Do not be glib. I am not being glib.
My voice stayed even.
I am being accurate. He exhaled hard. Olivia, this does not need to become a war. There it was. The escalation they always projected onto me whenever I stopped cooperating with their version of peace. Then do not make it one, I said. Another silence. Longer. This time. Your grandmother was emotional near the end, he said finally. People around her influenced her. I looked down at the letter on my table, at the firm ink of her handwriting, at the line where she said she had more confidence in me than in them. No, I said quietly. I think she just stopped pretending not to notice things. His voice hardened. Be very careful. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Warning dressed as concern. Authority reaching for its old costume. I intend to be, I said. Then I ended the call before he could say anything else. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was earned. I stood by the window as dusk began to gather over Cambridge, the rooftops darkening, the wet pavement below catching streaks of reflected light. My family would not stop. I knew that now. They would call, reframe, minimize,
push.
My mother would try softness. My father would try pressure. Madison would try injury first and outrage second. They would all, in their own ways, ask me to translate betrayal back into misunderstanding because misunderstanding was easier to survive. But the evidence had started to move. The walls were up. The records were being preserved. And somewhere inside me, beneath the grief and the shock and the strange new weight of being seen correctly, something steadier was beginning to take shape. Not hardness. Not yet. Just resolve. Quiet. Structural. The kind you do not notice from the street until the storm hits and the house is still standing. The next morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of Boston morning that makes every window look sharper than it is, and every breath feel a little more deliberate. I was up before 6, standing in my kitchen in socks with a mug of coffee going cool in my hands, staring at the blue folder on the counter as if it might say something new if I looked at it long enough. It did not. Paper rarely changes overnight. People do. That was what worried me. By 7:15, Naomi Reyes had already sent a detailed email confirming the inventory team's arrival at the Beacon Hill house at 8:30 sharp, along with the locksmith, the preservation consultant, and a digital records specialist. Every line of her message was clean, precise, impossible to misread. It calmed me more than I wanted to admit. I got dressed slowly. Dark wool coat, flat boots sensible enough for wet brick sidewalks, Hair pinned back. Minimal makeup. Not because I was trying to look severe. Because I needed nothing on me that felt performative. Today was not about appearance. It was about presence. Real presence. The kind that stays when rooms become uncomfortable. By the time I crossed the Longfellow Bridge, the Charles looked like brushed steel under the pale morning light. Traffic moved in patient clusters. My phone stayed silent for almost 20 minutes, which in my family counted as a blessing. Then Madison texted. I hope you are proud of yourself.
No greeting.
No context. Just accusation laid down like fact. I read it at a red light, set the phone face down on the passenger seat, and kept driving. By now I understood something that would have taken me years to admit before. My family did not actually want dialogue. They wanted access. Access to my attention. Access to my nervous system. Access to the old reflex that made me rush in and explain myself before they had even finished being unfair. Without that access, they lost rhythm. They lost control. They became clumsy. Beacon Hill looked exactly the way it always did in morning light. Polished brick. Black shutters. Iron railings still damp from the day before. Window boxes empty this early in the season. Quiet money held in architecture. I parked half a block away and stood for a second on the sidewalk before walking toward the house. My grandmother's house. The phrase still felt too large when it moved through my mind. Not because of the value, because of the weight of what it had meant for so long. Family myth. Inheritance fantasy. Social signal. And under all that, the quieter truth I had always felt but never fully named.
Work. Care.
Memory. The front steps were already occupied. Naomi Reyes stood near the gate in a camel coat with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, dark hair twisted into a low knot at the nape of her neck. Beside her was a tall man in a navy field jacket, likely the locksmith, and a woman in her 50s with silver-framed glasses and the attentive stillness of someone who made a living noticing what other people missed. The preservation consultant, I assumed. Naomi looked up as I approached and gave me the sort of smile that does not ask anything of you. Good morning, Olivia. Good morning. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Naomi introduced the others. This is Daniel Mercer, Security and Access Protocol. And this is Helen Brooks, Preservation Consultant. She worked with your grandmother on several restoration decisions over the years. Helen extended her hand. Your grandmother was formidable, she said. And usually right. I smiled despite everything. That sounds like her. Helen's expression softened. She trusted your eye, by the way. She told me that more than once. The words landed somewhere deep and strangely tender. Trusted your eye. Such a simple phrase. But in a family where my perceptions had been edited for years, minimized, softened, reframed, that kind of trust felt almost sacred. Daniel stepped toward the front door, but before he could reach for the key pouch, Naomi stopped him with one slight lift of her hand. One more thing, she said, opening her portfolio. A courier delivered records from Martin's office at 7:42 this morning. They include a written instruction from Mrs. Harper to be acknowledged before first entry today. Of course they did. I let out a breath that might almost have been laughter. Grandma really had turned timing into an art form. Naomi handed me a single sheet on heavy cream paper. The handwriting was not Grandma's this time. It was formal, typed clean, witness-signed. But at the bottom, just above her signature, there was one line in blue ink. Olivia first. Always before the performance begins. My throat tightened at once. Helen looked away politely, giving me space without making a scene of it. Daniel did the same. Naomi simply waited. I nodded once, folded the paper, and slipped it into my coat pocket beside Grandma's private letter. Let us do it, I said. Daniel unlocked the front door and then paused. Would you like to enter first? The question should not have undone me as much as it did. I had been in this house more times than I could count. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, winter Saturdays with tea in the kitchen, summer afternoons helping Grandma label archival boxes in the upstairs study. Yet never once had anyone asked me that question. Enter first, as if I belonged to the moment instead of standing slightly outside it. I stepped forward and crossed the threshold. The house smelled the way it always had. Cedar, old books, lemon polish, and the faint mineral scent of radiators that had spent decades heating old brick walls. Morning light filtered through the sidelights around the front door and stretched in pale bands across the entry floor. The marble console table was still there with the brass bowl Grandma dropped her gloves into. Her umbrella stand. The gilt mirror Madison loved taking pictures in. For one irrational second I expected to hear Grandma's voice from the back hall asking whether anyone wanted tea. Instead there was only silence. Deep, clean silence. The kind houses keep when they are waiting to see what will happen to them. Helen moved carefully through the front parlor, already taking notes. Daniel headed toward the alarm panel. Naomi opened her laptop at the dining room table and began cross-checking the preliminary inventory list. I stood in the center hall and let the house settle around me. Memory came quickly there. Not in dramatic flashes. In textures. The worn smoothness of the stair rail beneath my palm. The slight give in the third board near the library entrance. The angle of morning light on the wallpaper near the sitting room. Arch houses do that when you have loved them quietly. They return themselves in physical detail before emotion catches up. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, then buzzed again. I did not move. Naomi glanced up. You do not need to answer that. I know. She watched me for one extra beat, then nodded and went back to her screen. There was no pity in it, only respect. That, I was beginning to realize, was one of the most healing sensations in the world. To be treated as capable without being abandoned. To be supported without being managed. After about 15 minutes, Daniel approached with a small evidence pouch and a printed key log. 3 exterior keys were documented in the original household security file, he said. 1 assigned to Mrs. Harper. 1 held in secure office storage, and 1 copied privately some years ago without notation. We are reconciling access now. Copied privately by who? I asked. Daniel's expression remained neutral. We are not assigning that yet, but I noticed the tiny pause before he said it. Small. Controlled. Enough to tell me there was probably already a likely answer. Madison, I thought at once. Or, my mother. Someone who believed proximity was permission. Someone who had never had to distinguish between being welcome and being entitled. Helen called softly from the library. Olivia, when you have a moment? I followed her into the room. The library had always been my favorite space in the house. Dark built-ins. A worn Persian rug. 2 deep blue chairs by the front window. Grandma's reading lamp with the green glass shade. Helen stood near the desk at the far end, where several folders had been laid out in unnaturally neat alignment. These were left visible, she said quietly. Not hidden. Visible. On top of the stack was a label in Grandma's handwriting. For Olivia, if they start early. I stared at it, then looked at Helen. Start early? Helen's mouth curved faintly, not with humor exactly, but with recognition. Your grandmother was not only intelligent, she said. She was tired. I sat down slowly in the chair by the desk and lifted the top folder. Inside were copies of contractor invoices, insurance correspondence, municipal preservation notices, and handwritten notes in Grandma's script beside several dates. 1 note, underlined once, read, Patricia asking about market timing again. Another, Madison says lighter stone would photograph better. Does not ask what original quarry match costs. Another, Thomas raised estate liquidity before my follow-up scan. Noted. My skin went cold, but my mind cleared. This was not suspicion anymore. It was chronology.
Pattern.
Receipts with a pulse. She documented them. I said, though obviously she had. Helen's gaze was gentle. She documented everything once she realized no one was going to surprise her for the better. That sentence entered me slowly, like winter air, through a cracked window. I thought of the line in Grandma's letter. I had hoped they might surprise me.
I had more confidence in you.
There are some forms of grief that arrive not as devastation but as a grim, quiet sorting. You begin to understand not only that someone saw the truth, but how long they had to carry it alone. My phone rang again. This time Naomi looked up from the doorway. It is your mother, she said, glancing at the screen that had lit through the thin fabric of my coat pocket. Of course it was. I stood there in the library, surrounded by ledgers, notes, and the Preserved intelligence of the only person in my family who had ever loved me without trying to assign me a smaller role, and realized something with perfect clarity. They were going to keep pushing the emotional version of the story as long as I allowed it. They were going to keep framing themselves as wounded by process because process was the one thing that had finally interrupted their access. I slipped the phone from my pocket, watched it ring once more, and handed it to Naomi. "Please document the call attempt," I said. Naomi took it without surprise. "I will." And in that simple exchange, standing in my grandmother's library with morning light touching the edges of old books and the evidence of years spread quietly across the desk, I felt the next piece of me lock into place. Not anger. Not even vindication. Discipline. The kind my grandmother had trusted me with long before I understood she was training me to survive exactly this. Naomi documented the call attempt with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else.
Date. Time.
Duration before decline. Caller identity. Then she set my phone face down on the library desk beside Grandma's notes, as if my mother's name belonged there too. In a way, it did. Not as family. As data. That thought should have felt cold. Instead, it felt clarifying. Helen remained near the Biltons, carefully reviewing the preservation files, while Daniel moved through the lower level confirming lock changes and access points. The house had shifted around all of us in less than an hour. Not physically. The wallpaper still held its quiet blue pattern. The brass hardware still caught the pale morning light. The staircase still gave that faint, familiar creak near the landing turn. But the power inside the rooms had changed. For the first time in my life, this house was not absorbing my family's assumptions without protest.
It was answering them.
Naomi stepped into the library doorway a few minutes later, her expression controlled but alert. "I need to make you aware of something." I stood. "What is it?" "Your parents and sister are outside." Of course they were. I did not even feel surprised. I felt tired. Not weak tired. Just deeply aware of how predictable certain people become once boundaries begin to hold. "At the gate?" I asked. Naomi nodded. "Your father is demanding entry. Your mother is using a softer approach. Your sister appears to be recording voice notes or video on her phone." Helen closed the folder in front of her with quiet precision. "That would be the performance your grandmother anticipated." The phrase would have made me smile on another day. Not this one. Today it landed like confirmation. I looked through the library window toward the front walk. From that angle, I could not see them clearly, only shapes moving beyond the ironwork and the faint outline of Madison's pale coat. Even blurred, I recognized the arrangement immediately. My father out front, using force. My mother near enough to soften it. Madison turning herself into the injured center of the story. It had always been a system. I just had not always had the distance to name it. "Do they know we are inside?" I asked. "They saw Daniel's vehicle and the locksmith," Naomi said. "And they have likely guessed the inventory process began this morning." My phone buzzed again against the desk. Then again. Message after message. I did not need to read them to know the structure. "How could you do this? We need to talk. This is humiliating. Grandma would never have wanted this." The same argument in different clothes. Helen stepped closer to the window, but did not look out directly. "Historic houses teach you something useful," she said, almost absently. "Water rarely destroys a structure all at once. It gets in where small boundaries fail first." I turned toward her. She met my eyes over the rim of her glasses. "Your grandmother liked that metaphor." "She would," I said. Naomi opened her portfolio and removed a printed sheet. Martin anticipated the possibility of in-person escalation. He prepared a response protocol. Of course he had. Of course Grandma had made sure he did. Naomi placed the page on the desk between us. Step 1. No direct confrontation at the door. Step 2. Document presence and any demands for entry. Step 3. Offer written channel for item requests only. Step 4. If misrepresentation or pressure occurs, record for trust file. Step 5. Do not negotiate from the threshold. Threshold. Another word that suddenly felt larger than architecture. "What do you want to do?" Naomi asked. It was the first time anyone had asked me that all morning without already having an answer in mind. I looked down at Grandma's handwritten notes, at the list of remarks she had preserved with painful, disciplined accuracy. Patricia asking about market timing again. Madison says lighter stone would photograph better. Thomas raised estate liquidity before my follow-up scan. Noted. There it was. Years of being watched, measured, and finally recorded because trust had collapsed before Grandma ever did. Something in me settled. I do not want them inside, I said. Naomi nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else. Then they do not come inside. Daniel appeared in the doorway then, keyring clipped at his belt, expression steady. They are becoming louder, he said. Not dangerous, but louder. I exhaled slowly. Can they see in through the front parlor? Partially, he said. Curtains are drawn enough to limit visibility. My grandmother had hated fully open drapes in the morning. She said houses, like women, were not improved by constant display. I almost heard her saying it now. I will speak to them, I said. Naomi's head turned sharply. From where? Not at the door. I looked toward the library window again, then toward the front hall. From the top landing. Helen's mouth curved very slightly. Visible. Untouchable. Your grandmother would approve. So would I realized. There was a difference between hiding and refusing to be cornered. I followed Daniel into the front hall, Naomi just behind us with her tablet already open. The house felt intensely quiet compared to the sounds building outside. When we reached the staircase, I moved up to the first landing where the tall entry mirror reflected the lower hall in softened gold and blue. From there I could see through the glass inset above the door and one side window beside it. My father stood at the gate with the posture of a man who believed indignation itself should function like credentials. My mother was angled toward the house, one hand over her chest, already performing wounded civility for an invisible audience. Madison stood slightly back, phone in hand exactly as Naomi had said, her face arranged into something between disbelief and injury. Daniel opened the inner vestibule door, but not the outer one, maintaining the locked separation. Sound came through more clearly at once. There she is, Madison said, too quickly. My father looked up. Olivia. Open this door. Not hello. Not how are you. Not even a pretend version of concern. Just command.
Familiar.
Stripped down. I rested one hand on the stair rail. No, one syllable.
Clean.
It seemed to confuse him more than any speech could have. My mother stepped in at once. Olivia, sweetheart, please do not make this uglier than it already is. I almost smiled. Sweetheart. The emergency term she used when she needed me infantilized enough to mistake pressure for care. Then do not make it uglier, I said. Item requests can go through the trust administrator. Madison let out a breathy, incredulous laugh. Item requests? Are you serious right now? I looked at her. Really looked. The carefully styled hair, the pale cashmere coat, the expensive sunglasses pushed up over her head despite the gray light, the phone still angled just slightly, as if she might yet curate this into a story where she was the victim of someone else's sudden cruelty. Yes, I said. I am. My father gripped the gate hard enough for the metal to sound faintly against his ring. You do not get to shut us out of our own family home. There it was.
Our.
Not Grandma's. Not the trust's. Not even Madison's now that the document had failed them. Just ours. A collective claim built to erase the inconvenient specificity of the truth. It is not your home, I said. And right now it is not open to you. My mother's face changed. Just a fraction. The softness sharpened. This is exactly why your grandmother worried you could be rigid. The lie was almost elegant in its speed. If she had been anyone else, I might have admired the instinct. But there on the staircase of the house my grandmother had protected from them, with her notes in the next room and the trust restrictions already in force, I felt something new rise in me. Not outrage. Not even hurt. Precision. No, I said quietly. What worried Grandma was that none of you could hear the word no unless it came from a lawyer. Silence. Hard this time. Madison lowered the phone a full inch. My father stared at me as if he had never seen me clearly before and did not like what the improved focus revealed. My mother recovered first. "We are grieving too," she said. "And this public humiliation is unnecessary." "Then stop creating one," I answered. "Leave the gate. Send requests in writing.
Respect.
The trust." My father gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Listen to you. You think a packet of paper made you powerful." The old version of me would have flinched at that, would have needed to defend myself, explain that this was not about power, that I had not wanted conflict, that I was trying to do the right thing. But Grandma had finally given me something better than a defense. She had given me a structure. "No," I said. "It made the truth harder for you to ignore." Madison stepped closer to the gate then. "This is not the truth. This is you taking advantage of a technicality, because you have always been jealous." Jealous. The family diagnosis for any pain they did not feel like respecting. I looked at her and thought suddenly, sharply, of the note in Grandma's hand. "Madison says lighter stone would photograph better. Does not ask what original quarry match costs." That was it really. The difference between us in one line. Surface and stewardship. Image and burden. "You still think this is about winning something pretty," I said. "That is why Grandma did not choose you." Her face went white. My mother inhaled sharply, scandalized less by the truth than by the fact that I had finally said it aloud. My father pointed toward the door, fury now fully stripped of manners. "This conversation is not over." "I know," I said. "That is why it will be documented." Naomi, standing just behind the vestibule line with her tablet in hand, lifted her eyes to me very briefly. Not interruption. Recognition. I understood then that something important had just happened, not because I had out-talked them. I had not. People like my parents and Madison rarely run out of words. But I had changed the venue. They were still trying to have a family scene. I was having a trust proceeding. And those are not the same thing. My mother's expression shifted one last time. The softness returned, but thinner now, exhausted around the edges. "Olivia," she said, and for 1 second there was something almost real in her face. Not love exactly. Maybe fear. Maybe the dawning knowledge that the daughter they had treated as endlessly absorbent had finally become impermeable. "Please."
Such a small word.
And once, it would have been enough to undo me. Once, I would have opened the door just to prove I was not cruel. Just to prove I was still reachable. Just to prove I was a good daughter, whatever that meant in a family that only measured goodness by compliance. But my grandmother's house was behind me. Her records were in the library. Her trust was active. And her private letter was still in my coat pocket, like a hand at my back. I met my mother's eyes and answered with the calmest voice I had ever heard come out of my own mouth. "No." Then I nodded to Daniel. He closed the inner door. The sound was gentle, almost soft. But on the other side of it, for the first time in my life, my family was left outside the boundary instead of me. After Daniel closed the inner door, the house went quiet in a way that did not feel empty. It felt offended. The sound from outside dropped into a muffled blur, reduced to the faint shape of raised voices through old glass and thick brick, the kind of sound a well-built house knows how to survive without rearranging itself around it. I stayed on the staircase for a moment longer, one hand still resting on the polished rail, and felt my heartbeat slowly return to something steadier than adrenaline. Naomi remained just inside the vestibule, tablet in hand, eyes calm. Daniel checked the lock once, not nervously, simply thoroughly. Helen stood farther back in the hall, watching me with that same alert stillness she seemed to bring to every room. No one rushed toward me. No one flooded the silence with sympathy. And that, strangely, was the kindness. They let me have the moment without trying to interpret it for me. After a few seconds, Naomi spoke. "They are leaving the gate, but not the sidewalk." I nodded. "Documented. Already done." I let out a breath and moved down the staircase, one step at a time. The front hall looked exactly as it had 30 minutes earlier, and yet nothing in me was arranged the same way. I had said no. Not defensively. Not tearfully. Not with a speech stitched around it to make it easier for them to hear.
Just know.
It should not have felt revolutionary. But when you come from a family that treats your boundaries like temporary emotional weather, a clean refusal can feel like discovering a new language in your own mouth. Helen tilted her head toward the dining room. You should sit down before you make any more decisions. I almost smiled. Not because I was being managed, because she was right. We moved into the dining room, where winter light lay pale across the long table and Naomi's open laptop cast a cool rectangle of glow against the wood. A tray of labeled inventory bags sat on one end. Folded linen gloves.
A camera.
Printed forms. Systems upon systems. My grandmother would have approved. I sat in one of the side chairs and looked around at the familiar room. The chandelier. The crown molding. The faint line in the wallpaper near the far corner where a restoration had once been done so carefully only someone who loved the house would notice. Madison used to say this room looked good in candlelight. Grandma used to say it looked expensive to maintain. That had always been the difference between them. One saw atmosphere. The other saw stewardship. Naomi stepped closer and slid a single printed page toward me. There is one decision I need from you today. I looked down. Temporary Access Protocol for Personal Effects. A form allowing limited supervised retrieval of purely personal items by immediate family members once inventory classification was complete. My mother's scarf in the upstairs guest room if it truly belonged to her. Madison's cosmetics bag if it was hers and not simply left there. A few framed photographs of my parents and grandmother if they were duplicates and not part of the archival collection. Ordinary things. Human things. The kind of items people use to prove a conflict is not entirely about money, even when the money is what poisoned it. You do not have to approve anything today, Naomi said. But the trust allows compassion as long as it does not compromise control. They knocked loudly enough.
Part of me wanted that.
Not the best part, but a real part. The part that had sat through years of smaller humiliations with a polite face while Madison got center stage, and I got called mature for not bleeding publicly. The part that remembered Christmases arranged around her preferences, college decisions narrated as family investments when they benefited her and practical choices when they benefited me, the endless choreography of being expected to understand. Pain does not disappear just because it finally has paperwork. It only becomes easier to direct. Olivia, Helen said quietly from across the table, your grandmother protected the house from entitlement. She did not ask you to become cruel. I looked up at her. Her tone was gentle, but not indulgent. A reminder, not a rescue. And in that moment I heard Grandma too, not in any ghostly way, just in memory. Beauty without discipline decays. Entitlement without character destroys. She had not built all of this, so I could enjoy reversing the hierarchy. She had built it, so I would not have to live inside one anymore. Naomi waited without pressing. Daniel, now back from the front hall, set a fresh access log beside the form and said nothing at all. Again, the gift was the same. No one was telling me what kind of woman to be. They were simply creating a room where I could choose deliberately instead of reactively. I lowered my eyes to the form again. Compassion as long as it does not compromise control. There it was. The line. The one I had never been allowed to hold before. In my family, compassion had always meant yielding. Flexibility had always meant silence. Grace had always meant making myself easier to ignore. But this was different. This was mercy with structure. Humanity without self-erasure. I picked up Naomi's pen. They can retrieve clearly personal items, I said, signing on the designated line. Supervised. Pre-approved list only. No unscheduled access. No entry into private file rooms, attic storage, or the upstairs study. No discussion about the property during retrieval. Naomi nodded once. Understood. She made a notation beneath my signature and turned the page for me to initial the condition set. I did. My handwriting looked unusually steady. You are certain? She asked. I sat back and considered the question. Outside, the street noise had softened again. And somewhere in the house Daniel's new lock hardware gave a faint metallic click as he tested another access point. The ordinary sounds of protection. Yes, I said. I am not interested in punishing them. I am interested in ending the confusion. Helen's gaze rested on me for one long beat, and then she gave the smallest nod. Approval, maybe. Or recognition. It did not matter which. It was enough. Naomi folded the form into the active file and closed it with practiced precision. Then we proceed that way. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me. A text from my mother. I can come alone if that makes this easier. Another from Madison, seconds later. I only want Grandma's bracelet and my things from the guest room. Then for my father. You are making a strategic mistake by isolating yourself. I stared at the 3 messages lined up on the screen and felt, for the first time, not pulled by them. Just informed. 3 styles of pressure. Softness. Sentiment.
Threat.
Same motive. Access.
Control.
Narrative. I handed the phone to Naomi without replying. Please add these to the file. Of course. She photographed the screen, logged the timestamps, and returned the phone face down.
Such a simple act.
Yet every time one of them treated my family's behavior as something to be documented instead of endlessly emotionally processed, I felt a little more sane. A little more anchored in reality. Because that was the hardest thing about growing up around manipulation. Not the volume of it. The repetition. The way it slowly persuades you that your discomfort is vague, your memory selective, your limit selfish, your instincts dramatic. Documentation interrupts that spell. Facts do not love you, but they do not gaslight you either. Around noon, the inventory team finished the lower level and moved upstairs. Naomi reviewed the first sealed item list with me in the dining room, while Helen walked through the rear parlor noting humidity concerns and drapery exposure. At one point I stood and drifted into the kitchen, more from instinct than intention. The room was unchanged. Butcher block island. White cabinets. The old copper kettle Grandma refused to replace because she said newer ones had no dignity. I rested my hand against the counter and remembered standing there at 27 while she showed me how to read the annual insurance rider on the house, line by line, because if you own anything beautiful, someone will eventually try to turn your ignorance into their advantage. At the time I thought she meant contractors. Maybe she had. Maybe she had meant more than that all along. I stayed there for a moment, letting the memory settle. Then I returned to the dining room where Naomi had laid out the preliminary personal effects protocol for final review. At the bottom of the page, above my signature line, one sentence stood out. Approval of limited retrieval does not constitute restoration of trust, transfer rights, or informal family access. I read it twice, then a third time, and something inside me eased. Because there it was in legal language. The truth I had spent years trying and failing to articulate emotionally. Being decent to someone does not mean reopening the door they used to walk through carelessly. Offering humanity does not erase history. Boundaries do not become less real because they are exercised with courtesy. I signed the page. Naomi gathered it into the file. Outside the front windows, the cold afternoon light had begun to tilt, sharpening the ironwork shadows against the brick. Somewhere beyond the glass, my family was probably telling themselves a story already. That I had changed. That grief had made me hard. That money had exposed my ambition. Let them. For once, their version was not the one carrying legal weight. For once, kindness did not require me to disappear. And sitting there in my grandmother's dining room with the trust document signed, the access rules clear, and the house still standing around me exactly as she had left it, I realized the real decision in front of me had never been whether I would become cruel enough to hurt them back. It was whether I could finally be clear enough to stop rescuing them from the consequences of who they had chosen to be. The first request for supervised retrieval came the next morning at 9:12. Not from my father. Not from Madison. Charity gala in 2008, and a small jewelry case, she said, contained costume pieces with sentimental value only. Sentimental value only. The phrase sat on the screen with all the delicate manipulation of a gloved hand. Naomi forwarded it to me with one line beneath. Recommend approval of clearly personal, non-disputed items under supervision. I stared at the email from my kitchen table in Cambridge with my coffee cooling beside me and the morning light cutting across the wood floor in long pale bars. Ordinary morning. Ordinary apartment. And yet everything in my life still felt like it was being measured in before and after. Before Grandma's second envelope. After. Before my family understood there were now records. After. Before I realized I did not need their agreement to recognize a pattern. I didn't know what she meant. She meant hierarchy. Informality. The old family privilege of bypassing whatever rules existed because feelings were allegedly more sacred than process. She meant that my mother felt dishonored by structure, and everyone around her was now expected to treat that dishonor as the true emergency. Linda lowered her voice slightly. People are talking. I almost smiled. Not because it surprised me, because it arrived so predictably. The social pressure phase.
About what?
I asked. About how severe this all seems. About whether Evelyn was fully herself at the end. About how quickly things changed. There it was. Doubt as etiquette. Gossip in pearls. I leaned back in my chair. Nothing changed quickly, I said. Documentation just caught up. Linda exhaled. You sound very certain. I am. She was silent long enough that I could feel her recalculating. Then she tried another angle. Madison is taking this very hard. I imagine she is. She says you humiliated her. That one landed differently. Not because it hurt. Because it revealed the scale of Madison's self-absorption with such clean precision. Humiliation. Not grief. Not confusion about Grandma's wishes. Not concern over what had been exposed. Humiliation. As if the deepest injury here were that the room had not reflected her back to herself the way it always had. Aunt Linda, I said quietly, being contradicted is not the same thing as being humiliated.
She did not answer right away.
Then, more coolly than before, she said, I hope you know what you are doing. I thought of Grandma's notes, of Naomi's files, of Helen standing in the library with her careful, witness-like stillness, of Martin sliding that second envelope across the desk. For the first time, I said, I really do. When I arrived at the Beacon Hill house a little before 11, the day had sharpened into clear winter brightness. The kind that makes old brick look almost red and ironwork cast exact shadows on the front walk. Daniel was already there. Naomi too. Helen had come by for a short preservation review of the upstairs drapery and had stayed when she heard there would be supervised access. Another witness. Another steady presence. Nothing about the house felt theatrical now. Only prepared. At exactly 11:05, my mother arrived alone. She wore a charcoal wool coat, pearl earrings, and the expression she reserved for hospital. Waiting rooms, charity funerals, and any occasion where she wanted grief to read as dignity from a distance. Daniel met her at the gate, confirmed her name, logged the time, and explained the scope of access. She smiled as if the formality amused her. Must we really do all this? Daniel's tone remained even. Yes. He led her in through the vestibule and into the front hall where I was waiting near the staircase with Naomi beside me. For one brief moment, the look on my mother's face was naked. Not rage. Not sorrow. Something almost like disbelief that all the old choreography had failed. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar controlled softness. Olivia. Mom. Things sadder. We had reduced a lifetime of manipulation to a narrow corridor of supervised movement and item verification, and in that corridor, she looked less like a villain than a woman encountering limits she had never imagined would apply to her. She stopped in the front hall and looked at the photograph. It was one of her and Grandma at some gala I barely remembered, both of them smiling at the camera under ballroom lights, elegant and composed and unrevealing. She loved me, you know. My mother said quietly. It was the first thing she had said all morning that did not sound strategic. And because of that, it hurt more. I believed her. That was part of what made all of this so ugly. Love had existed here. It just had not prevented harm. I know, I said. Her fingers tightened around the frame. Then why would she do this? The hallway was very still. Even Naomi paused typing. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not just the machinery she had spent years operating, but the cost of it. The way entitlement calcifies into confusion when it is finally interrupted. The way favoritism can start as preference and end as a whole worldview no one inside it can recognize anymore. Because she saw what was happening, I said softly. And because loving you is not the same thing as agreeing with you. My mother's face changed then. Not dramatically. Just enough. A tiny collapse around the mouth. A brief unguarding in the eyes. She looked down at the photograph again and said, almost to herself, I did what I thought was best. There are sentences that explain a life without excusing it. That was one of them. Best for who? Best according to what? Best at what cost? I felt no urge to argue. No urge to comfort. Only clarity. I know, I said. That was the problem. She lifted her head and met my eyes. For one suspended second, we were not mother and daughter in a power struggle. We were just two women standing in a beautiful old hallway between what had been permitted and what no longer would be. Madison is struggling, she said. There it was. Back to center. Back to the child around whom every orbit had been arranged. I did not sigh. I did not roll my eyes. I just listened. She feels betrayed, my mother continued. She thought your grandmother, she stopped. Could not finish. Because there was no noble end to that sentence. She thought your grandmother would reward what the family had always rewarded. Surface. Ease. Performance. I cannot fix that for her, I said. My mother gave the faintest nod, as if some part of her had known that before she asked. Daniel opened the vestibule door. Naomi logged the exit time. Helen did not look up from her notes. My mother stepped onto the threshold, then turned back once more. You seem very calm, she said. The old accusation, disguised as observation. But there was less contempt in it than there used to be. Maybe even curiosity. I touched the folded edge of Grandma's private letter in my coat pocket. I spent a long time practicing in rooms where no one thought I mattered, I said. That kind of training looks like calm when it finally has somewhere to stand. My mother held my gaze for a beat too long, then walked out into the cold, white light. Daniel closed the door gently behind her. Naomi finished the log entry. Helen turned a page in her notebook. And I stood there in the center of the hall, listening to the house settle around me, understanding something I had not fully seen until that moment. The world outside would keep simplifying the story. They would say it was about money, about a house, about a will. But standing there after my mother's visit, after Aunt Linda's call, after the first visible shift in family gravity, I knew better. This was about what happens when a woman who has been edited for years finally becomes legible on her own terms. By the end of the 90 days, the house no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer. Not because the paperwork had become simpler. If anything, there had been more of it. More trust reviews. More preservation assessments. More item logs. More quiet, exhausting proof that almost everything valuable in life requires maintenance. No one applauds. But somewhere in the middle of those weeks, between early morning calls with Naomi, walk-throughs with Helen, and evenings spent alone in the library with my grandmother's notes spread out beside a cup of tea gone cold, something inside me had stopped bracing. I had spent so much of my life expecting every good thing to come with a correction, a condition, a reminder that it belonged more naturally to someone else. And then, piece by piece, that expectation began to loosen. Not vanish. Just loosen. The final trust review was held on a bright afternoon in late spring. Boston had turned soft at the edges by then. Window boxes along the street were beginning to fill again. The courtyard behind the house had started waking up with stubborn green along the brick. Martin Whitaker sat at the same polished table where everything had first detonated, the same room, the same measured voice, but this time the air felt different. Not tense. Resolved. Naomi was there with the accounting packet. Helen had submitted her preservation report 2 days earlier, noting that the property had remained stable, protected, and properly maintained throughout the stewardship period. Daniel had filed the final access and security summary. Everything was in order. Every box checked. Every condition satisfied. Martin folded his hands and looked at me over the file. Olivia Bennett, pursuant to the terms of the Harper Family Residential Trust and based on the completed review, the stewardship designation is confirmed. Effective today, Full authority transfers to you under the terms outlined in the final instrument.
Just like that.
No music.
No applause. No cinematic swell.
Only paper. A sentence. A pen placed where I could reach it. Maybe that was why it mattered so much. Because for once the most life-changing thing that had ever happened to me did not arrive as a performance. It arrived as structure. I signed my name slowly. Olivia Bennett. Same hand. Different woman. When it was done, Martin closed the folder with soft finality. Naomi smiled, small and warm. Helen touched my forearm once and said, "She chose correctly." I thanked them all, and I meant it more than I had words for. Not because they had rescued me, because they had refused to distort reality just to make difficult people more comfortable. That is rarer than most people admit. After the meeting, I walked back to the house alone. The front door opened with the new key Daniel had issued me weeks earlier, but this time when I stepped inside, there was no adrenaline in it. No sense of crisis. Only quiet. The late afternoon light lay across the entry floor in warm gold bands. The gilt mirror held a softened reflection of the hall. Somewhere in the back of the house, the old pipes clicked faintly as the system adjusted. Home, the house seemed to say. Not in a sentimental way. In a structural one. I set my bag down on the console table and stood there for a moment with my hand resting lightly on the marble top, listening to the stillness. Then I went upstairs to my grandmother's study. I had saved one thing for that day. In the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath the preserved household ledgers and a folder labeled roofline repairs, there was a sealed envelope Naomi had found during the final archive review. For Olivia, after it is truly yours. I had not opened it earlier. It felt important to wait until the house no longer sat in uncertainty. Until I no longer did. I took the envelope to the window seat overlooking the back courtyard and opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter, only one page. Olivia, if you are reading this in peace, then you have already done the hardest part. Not keeping the house. Keeping your judgment. Anyone can win a room for an hour. Very few people can hold their integrity for 90 days, while disappointed people circle, like weather. I smiled through the sudden sting in my eyes. That was her.
Exact.
Unsparing. Loving in a way that never confused softness with honesty. I kept reading. If you choose to live here for a time, do it because you enjoy the morning light in the front parlor and know where the third stair complains in winter. If you choose to sell one day, do it without shame and with proper standards. A house is not sacred because it is old or expensive. It is sacred because of how truthfully it is kept. That line stayed with me.
Truthfully, it is kept.
Not inherited. Not displayed.
Kept.
There was one final paragraph. I know you were taught that being overlooked meant being lesser. It never did. It only meant certain people needed you dimmer than you were, so they could remain comfortable in poor light.
Do not help them with that anymore.
I folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands for a long minute before setting it in my lap.
Outside.
The courtyard leaves moved gently in the late spring air. Somewhere farther down the block, a door closed, footsteps passed. Life continued. And inside that room, in the house my family had treated like a trophy and my grandmother had treated like a test of character, I understood at last that this had never really been about property. The house was only the place where the truth became impossible to edit. My mother called 3 weeks later. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. Just to ask whether I would meet her for coffee. I said yes. Not because everything was healed. It was not. Not because I owed her easy access again. I did not. I said yes because by then I understood the difference between contact and surrender. We met in a quiet cafe on Newberry Street, the kind with small marble tables and too many mirrors. She looked elegant, tired, older around the eyes than I remembered. We spoke politely at first. Weather. Her volunteer board. A mutual cousin's engagement. Then she set down her cup and said, "Madison is still angry." I nodded. I know. My mother looked at me for a long second. And you? It was the first honest question she had asked me in months, maybe years. I thought about answering simply.
Fine. Busy.
Tired. But those were the old answers. The edited ones. So, I told the truth. I am calmer than I used to be, I said, and sadder than I expected. She lowered her eyes. I did not think, she stopped. Tried again. I did not realize how much you saw. I almost smiled, not because it was satisfying, because it was late, and lateness has its own kind of ache. That was part of the problem, I said. Everyone assumed I would keep seeing it and say nothing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing to something she could no longer argue with. We did not resolve our whole history over coffee. Real life rarely offers that kind of convenience. But when we stood to leave, she touched my arm lightly and said, "The house looks beautiful." I met her gaze and answered the only honest way I could. I know. After she left, I walked the length of Newbury Street alone in the mild afternoon light, past shop windows and flowering trees and couples carrying shopping bags and iced drinks, and I realized I was not hurrying to call anyone, not to explain, not to defend, not to soften. For the first time in my life, the story did not need to be translated into something more digestible before I could live inside it. That evening, back in Beacon Hill, I opened the windows in the front parlor and let the late spring air move through the room. The house smelled like old wood, lemon polish, and the city warming after winter. I stood with one hand resting on the mantel and looked at the room my sister had once seen as a backdrop, my mother had seen as a symbol, and my grandmother had seen for what it was. A place that demanded care without performance. A place that could not be held together by charm. I used to think Grandma had left me a $4 million house. That was the simplest version, the social version, the version strangers would understand fastest. But standing there in the fading light, with the windows open and the house quiet and my own name finally feeling like it belonged fully to me, I knew that was not what she had really given me. She had given me proof. Proof that being underestimated had never made me small. It had made me observant, precise, harder to fool. She had given me a line between kindness and surrender, between family and access, between peace and silence. And most of all, she had given me the one thing my parents never meant to. A moment so clear, so undeniable, that I could never again confuse their version of me with the truth.